Okay, let's see. We are screen sharing and we are recording. Okay, so you can see the model that I have here. And so basically, let me run it. I'll just run it a couple times and then we'll talk about the basics of how it works. So I have this vehicle that takes entities that go up and down this one path. And so the entities arrive. I just have it. I think I have it set for one entity now, so I have to rerun it every time. So let me increase that here, and then we can talk about what's going on. Let me just increase this to, I don't know, 25 or something. So I have a maximum number. And so what we want to happen is the entities when they get to this transfer node, we want the vehicle to take them up. But when they come back down on the transfer node, we want them to go to the sink without being on the vehicle. And the same thing up at in the second transfer node, that I want the not to go on a vehicle when they go around this way, but I want them to come back down on the vehicle when they go this way. Okay, and so that's the basic behavior that we want to model. And so let me go back here and talk about, go back to one and talk about basically how this works in Simeo. So I have the vehicle, and in the transfer nodes, we have this option to ride on transporter. And so when an entity, when you set that to true, or always or conditional, it's going to require the corresponding vehicle. So what we want is a conditional request to ride on a vehicle. So basically, if it's coming from this direction, we want it to ride the vehicle up. If it's coming from this direction, we don't. Same thing up here. If it's coming from this direction, we want the vehicle, but if it's coming from this direction, we don't. So we have that same basic condition. And the way I chose to implement that condition is I have my palette entity, and I just have an entity state here that I think, let's see, what do I call my entity state? I call my entity state heads. So then if you, I just have that entity state, which is set to its default value. And so my condition for requiring a vehicle here is heads equal 1. So when the entity is created, I assign that value, heads equal 1. And so when it gets here, this condition is met, and so therefore it requests the vehicle. Then I assign that value of 0 up here on the server. You can see that I have this after processing state assignment. I change the value of that entity state to 0. And then I also change the picture. So that's what makes it turn red when it finishes processing. And so when the entity gets here, the value of heads is 0. And so it's the transfer node up here is then conditional on that value being 0. And so it requests the vehicle. But when the entity gets right here, since the value of heads is 0 now, then that condition is not met. And so the entity just leaves the vehicle and goes to the sink. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so what we want is to look at a little bit of detail about how that actually works. So if you just want this default behavior where the vehicle, just picks up the entity whenever it's requested, that, you don't really have to do anything. The vehicle, that's how the vehicle's structured. But if you want to control the vehicle in more detail, you need to look at exactly what's going on here. And there are a couple things that I'll show you that drive that. If I go to my basic node here, and I'm just going to turn the watch on and look at my transfer node, and then let me just do a step and then look and watch the vehicle. So I've got the transfer node in the vehicle, and there are two things of interest to me. There's something called the ride pickup queue associated with the transfer node. You see that right here, ride pickup queue. It has nothing in it. So when an entity gets to this node and you have the value set to, you have the request ride set to true, then what's going to happen is the entity is going to be put in this ride pickup queue. Okay. And so that happens automatically. We're going to see that in just a second. And when that happens, simultaneously from when the entity gets put in the ride pickup queue, Simeo internally will fire an event, and firing that event causes the vehicle to search for entities that are in a ride pickup queue. Okay, so this vehicle, once an entity is placed in that ride pickup queue, the vehicle is going to get a signal. You can think of it as that. So what happens is Simeo fires an event, and the vehicle logic is listening for that event. And so then in the vehicle, there is something called the what's it called? Visit request queue. And so the visit request queue is what happens when an entity is, say, at a transfer node and it's in the ride request queue. The vehicle says, hey, I can come get you. The entity says yes. Then the entity's moved out of the ride request queue and put in the visit request queue. And that's what causes the vehicle to actually move. Okay. So if you run it for a second and look, let's see here. And I just stop it in the middle here. Here I have my vehicle. I guess I turn that watch off. And then if I look in my visit request queue, I don't have anything because the entity is actually already on the vehicle. Okay, so let me see if I can run it a little bit and cause one to happen. So there you go. So now the vehicle was parked at home. The entity had arrived at its at the transfer node. Okay, and so now you can see this one's turned red because I still had the watch on. And so the visit request queue is for the vehicle is now set to 1. Okay, it has one value, and that's pallet 26. So basically the vehicle is on its way to pick this one up. Okay, so again, the basic way the process works is the entity arrives at the node, gets in that visit request queue, the vehicle is signaled, the vehicle makes a decision, and then once it's agreed, then it gets put in this visit request queue, the vehicle goes and gets it. Okay.
So if there is one also arriving on the bottom part to the basic node 1, so it also goes to the visit request.
Yeah, so there are 2 visit request queues. So each one of these transfer nodes has a visit request queue.
Okay.
So if I go to, if I go, let's see here, let's watch this one. And then let's reset this to do more. Let's do 25 or something like that. And then run it for a little while. So there was I don't guess it happens fast enough. We don't have arrivals fast enough where we're going to be able to see it in both of them. Maybe so. So this one is right here. And in transfer node 2, the ride pickup queue has this one right here. This one is in the ride pickup queue. And then in transfer node 1, it doesn't have anything in the ride pickup queue because this entity is probably in the vehicle queue already.
Right.
Okay, so that is that transferring between the queues that makes things that causes it to happen. Okay, so if we want to intercept things, okay, let me show you how I set this model up so that we can do that. Okay, so I went back and set this to 1, right? And so what you have to do is if you look at the vehicle, it has an add-on process trigger called evaluating transport request. And so what happens is when an entity arrives at the ride request queue, visit request queue, and I said it fires an event, and the vehicle goes and says, I'm going to come pick you up. Okay, this gets fired, and you can cause it to not happen by just setting token return value equals 0. Okay, so let me show you this model, and then I'll explain how I did it. Okay, so I'm going to set this value, and again, I'll come back and explain what all is going on here in just a second, but just set that equal to 1, number rejects equal 1, and make sure that this guy is set to maximum arrivals 1. And so I'm going to run. So it looks the same so far, except this time when the entity gets to the node, nothing happens. Because what happened is when I set that rejects to 1, it rejected that request. Okay, and so if I go back and look at the watch, you're going to see this entity is still in the visit request queue, but it's not in the vehicle queue because it rejected the vehicle's request. Okay, and so again, you can do that. Let me stop the model here. In this add-on process right here, evaluating vehicle transfer request, and that's this process right here. And so what I did was I set the model up to where if the entity was at transfer node 2, and I set another entity state on the another state on the entity called rejects, so that I could say I want to reject this request if the number of rejects is less than some global amount. Okay, so again, go back and look at the entity definitions, and here's my rejects, and so its initial value is 0. So when an entity is created, when an entity is created, it has a rejects value of 0. And so when it gets to this node, the second time when it comes around and it triggers that add-on process, the add-on process is going to say, hey, this model entity rejects is less than this global number of rejects. Okay. And if that's the case, then I'm going to set token return value to 0. Okay, does that make sense? And when I set token return value to 0, that's saying, hey, don't come get this. Okay, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay, so I also have this rejects. And so let me go back and look at my definition. So here's my global value num rejects, and it has a default value of 0, right? And so if I put that to 0 in my number of rejects, so this was our default behavior that we saw earlier, that's why it didn't reject the request, because it's equal to 0. And so this condition on that add-on process fails. But as soon as I set it to 1, okay, now that condition in the add-on process, this condition right here becomes true, because the number of rejects on the entity is less than this global number of 1. And so it returns that token return value of 0. And at the same time, it increments the number of rejects. Okay, so when I run it, if I run the model, set that equal to 1, and look at the model, okay, and now when it comes back around, okay, again, the entity's not going to get it. So let me pause the model and then go in and look at this entity, right? So if you look at this entity, if I watch the entity here, here's where num rejects somewhere in here. Let's see, where is it? Rejects, got to have a state. Here it is right here. Okay, so rejects is now equal to 1 because it got rejected. Okay.
Right.
Now,
And
so the question now is, well, how do I get the entity? How do I get the vehicle to go back and say, hey, I want to reevaluate?
Right.
Okay. So let me stop it here in just a second. And before I talk about that, let me just do one other thing. Let me go back and set this equal to some number. Let's say 10. Okay. So I still have that reject equal 1. Right. So when an entity comes around, it's going to have rejects equal to 0. So it's going to reject an initial request. But what happens is when this entity comes around, it's going to reject it. But I have other entities that are here. So this one looks like it didn't get rejected, but it did. It got rejected. But then when an entity comes at this node, that's saying, hey, go check everyone's ride request queue. Okay. And so if you look at these guys coming out, if you look at these entities right here, if I watch this entity right here, its num rejects, you know, has a value of 1. So it was rejected, but it just the vehicle did replanning. Okay. And so when you look here, I'm rejecting it every time, but every time a new entity comes, it's replanning. So what you'll see is, since I set the value to 10, I set the maximum value to 10, there are no more entities coming. So this one has been rejected. Right. So there's, it's sitting there saying, okay, I need to reevaluate. But since we don't have any more entities coming here, it doesn't evaluate. Okay. So the idea of reevaluating is you can do with another step called plan visit. Okay, so plan visit is basically saying I have this plan visit step that says, hey, I want vehicle 1 to do a visit plan. Okay, and that's saying the plan visit is essentially go look at all these requests and see if you're going to accept any of them. Okay, that's exactly what happens when an entity arrives at a transfer request, is it evaluates those requests. I can force that to happen with a plan visit. So the way I have this model structured is I have this plan visit and I have an event. So this whole process is triggered by an event, right? So go by definitions, I created an event. And so this process is triggered by that event. And then I have this button that causes that event to occur. Okay. So if I were to go back here and go back and set this one to 1, like we had it, and let it run for a while. So it goes up, takes the entity, comes back, it's going to reject. So it rejected the request, and now I need to trigger another one. So if I just click on plan visit, it reevaluates and goes. Okay. So what happened is when I click on this, it just triggers that plan visit. I can also change it. So if I go back and say, okay, I want it to be rejected twice. So let's say that I change that global number of rejects to 2. Okay. And then I run it, then the entity is going to come around. It's going to reject just like it did before. But now when I click on plan visit, it doesn't go, right? Well, the reason it doesn't go is because it just rejected the second one, right? Because I have that condition in there saying rejects less than 2. But if I do it a third time, or I click it a second time for a third evaluation, now it does it. Okay, so I have this relationship between rejecting the request, right, which happens again, that rejection happens in this add-on process of evaluating transport requests by just assigning token return value equal to 0, and the plan visit step, which lets you plan a visit, right? And so you can have the planned visit can be caused by anything. You know, it's caused automatically anytime an entity arrives at a transfer node with a ride request, that triggers a planned visit. That's why you saw them being blocked. You saw, even though we were rejecting the request here, because we had a request here, it still picked these guys up,
Right.
because it looks globally. Okay, but you could also attach that planned visit to other, other conditions and other parts of your model. It doesn't have to be through a button. Similarly, you can have arbitrarily complex logic here, right? I just set up a really simple one that said, I want to block this one, and then I want to increment that number of rejects. But here's where you would put any kind of condition that you want. So if you don't want the vehicle to go pick up an entity, if, unless, for example, you had 3 entities waiting on this path, you could set that condition. Right. So you just have to figure out how to define that condition. So this conveyor, I have this set up as a conveyor. And so you could have the condition be, the number on the conveyor is less than 3, reject it. And then it would reject. And then when it got over 3, then it would accept, and so on.
Oh.
Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, sir.
So again, the critical part is understanding that you reject the request. And so you can have any kind of decision logic that you want to reject the request. And then the second thing you have to understand is if you want to plan a visit, if you want it to say, okay, now go get something, okay, you can just click on, or you can just execute that plan visit step.
Can I have that event to be every, 5 seconds? How would I do that?
If you want, in other words, if you want this plan visit to happen every 5 seconds,
yes,
you could just trigger it with a timer, right? So I could go here and say, let's create let's see here. I don't want state, I want an element. Where's my timer? Time offset, 5 seconds. 5 seconds. And 5 seconds. Okay, so this is going to then reevaluate every 5. This is going to tick every 5 seconds. And so then I could just set this process, instead of event 1, I could have timer 1. Where's timer 1? Timer 1 event. So now this event will be processed every 5 seconds.
And then the vehicle might be in use. However, it would always be checking every 5 seconds and then decide what to do.
Yeah, I mean, but you're going to have to implement the logic so that it rejects the automatic request, right? Because remember, when an entity gets to a transfer node, there's an automatic request. So you have to set up your logic to reject those. Like if you want to reject every automatic request and you want to force the request yourself, then you have to reject all of those, but then accept the ones that you're setting, right? So you're going to have to implement a little bit of logic to do that, but it would be pretty straightforward to do.
Oh, I see.
Okay.
Let me think.
And by the way, I didn't show this, but you can see all this happening if you turn the trace on too. I just use watch so I could show you the things, but if you turn trace on, you're going to see this happening. You're going to see the event getting triggered, and you're going to see exactly the sequence of things that happen.
And is this the model that you sent me, or no?
I sent you this, but it doesn't have any of the logic to.
Yeah. Okay.
It doesn't have any logic to reject. I'm happy to send you this one if you want.
Yeah, if you can.
Okay.
I'll be glad to have it.
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
So my advice on how you should proceed is I'll send you this model, and you should play around with this model and make sure you understand kind of the basic ways in which you can cause a planned visit to occur. You can reject a request and so on, so that you understand basically that you understand those processes, then try to figure out how to implement the specific logic that you have, right? Because it's really important to understand, how this planned visit step works, and how when you set token return value to 0 on this add-on process, how that works and so on, and when the visit requests happen automatically.
Yeah. And
And if you just play around with the simple model, you'll be able to see that happen.
mhm. Yeah, that's what I wanted to do first. I wanted to play with it and try to understand it, and then understand it pretty good, so I feel comfortable on what to expect when I change anything.
Yep, that's what I suggest.
Yeah.
One thing that I forgot to mention during my recording with Anna that I want to mention here for the video is make sure and have a look at the plan visit step help. So I'm going to go to search. I'm going to look at plan visit, and I can look at the help for the step, which gives you information about that step, but it also refers to the SIMBIT vehicle fleet management. So if you look at this SIMBIT, it will be really helpful in trying to understand how vehicles work and how you can change the default behavior in a little bit more complex of a model than the one that I demonstrated here. So if you're interested in the vehicle behavior and modifying the standard vehicle behavior, this is the first place to look, is this vehicle fleet management SIMBIT.